uh, esteemed council members of the USI, of panelists of the day, and participants in this seminar. We are very happy to host this seminar on a very contemporary issue today, when the two-front war is staring us in the eyes. Before I hand over the proceedings to the moderator, Dr. Roshan, who is our Senior Research Fellow, Assistant Director Research, and extensively researches on nuclear issues and also authored books and monographs. I would like to flag a few broad issues, which I'll request the panelists to factor in their articulations subsequently. Now, we all know that globally, there is a trend of miniaturization, adding lethality and survivability of nuclear arsenals by all nuclear weapon states. Also, countries are testing low-yield devices. THAAD and BMD are being deployed, and there is saber rattlings by some of the nuclear states, particularly Russia. In the meanwhile, the confidence building measures have taken a setback because US has abrogated INF treaty, and there is unlikely extension of START as well. Some of the countries are developing deep range and deep penetration kinetic weapons to neutralize strategic weapons. And more importantly, there is use of disruptive technology like artificial intelligence, cyber weapons, hypersonic weapons for surveillance of nuclear weapons, as also for soft kill of command and control systems. Now, when we zoom in to South Asia, we see that in the Indian context, collusive hybrid threat in a nuclear environment is a reality, whereas the dynamics of Pak and India nuclear balance are well known, but some new factors have come on the horizon, like use of tactical nuclear weapons by Pakistan, what they call it as a nuclear defensive deterrence against India's cold start strategy. And they're also fast developing their sea leg, and there is always a risk of nuclear terrorism, being used both by state-sponsored actors and state. So there is a risk of, these nuclear weapons passing onto the hands of state-sponsored proxies. So that's another risk. Now, when we get on to China, as we know, there is a conventional combat power asymmetry between us and Chinese. And logically, India should have a credible strategic nuclear deterrence to bridge this power asymmetry. But nothing much is being talked about that part, particularly how India is going to counter China's rocket force, develop a credible sea leg, operationalize Agni 5, and also take lead in disruptive technologies. So I would request that we discuss today, besides what has been flagged by the moderator, that what is the efficacy of India's deterrence against proxy war being unleashed by China? Secondly, what should it entail to have a credible strategic deterrence against China? What all we need to do? What is the state of India's progress in introducing niche and disruptive technologies in the nuclear domain? And lastly, the very efficacy of our nuclear doctrine, particularly against China. Do we have the capability to actually revise and declare a new doctrine, or we should wait for some more time till we develop a credible nuclear capability and then think about doctrine? So with these few words, I'll now request Dr. Roshan to take us through the proceedings. Over to you, Dr. Roshan.
Thank you so much, General Sharma. Before I start, may I request all the panelists to take 7 to 10 minutes to answer each questions so that we can have 2 to 3 rounds before I open the session for question answer. My first question is to Lieutenant General Amit Sharma. As we know that Pakistan has reviewed a nuclear posture. Now to talk about full spectrum response. That means the nuclear weapons are both at the tactical as well as the strategic level. She is developing her triad. And as General Sharma mentioned, she has also continued with her proxy war. On the other hand, China is undergoing nuclear modernization with new precision platforms, which are more diverse. She is increasing reprocessing plutonium capabilities, developing automation-enabled launch and warning capabilities, and AI-enabled offensive platforms. All these are contrary to her stated posture of no first use.
सिस्टम में वो बोल रहा था उस सिस्टम की प्रॉब्लम बस ये कनेक्ट हो जाएगा जैसे ही निकाला आपने ब्लूटूथ ऑन करा उसका ये राइट है
Please mute yourself, whoever is speaking on. May I request you to please mute?
ऊपर को करना नीचे ये ऊपर रहेगा.
Under this background, do you see, General Sharma, that India needs to review her nuclear doctrine, or you feel the doctrine is still strong and the nuclear deterrence is effective? Over to you, General Sharma.
Thanks, Roshan. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, it's always a pleasure to be with the USI and to see a number of friendly faces. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel with Dr. Karnad. We've been together earlier too, and it's always a pleasure to be with him. It's a very vast canvas that we've spoken about, but I shall give about 5 or 6 major points in the next 5 minutes, what Roshan has said, about China, Pakistan, and the others also. As far as India is concerned, we are today among the most nuclearized regions of the world. Out of the 9 nuclear weapon powers that are there in the world, we have 7 in our region. It's namely India, Pakistan, China, the 3 of us. You got Israel, you got Russia, you got North Korea, and you also got United States because of its extended responsibilities. Now, that does not mean that we're heading for a nuclear holocaust and we are in the center of it. What we have to remember is that most of the nuclear weapon states which are there, the role of nuclear weapons is to deter anybody from using nuclear weapons against us or itself. And this is actually the role very clearly stated of the Indian nuclear weapons. It is basically to deter anybody from using nuclear weapons against us. It has got nothing to do with conventional war. It is Pakistan. They say that the role is to prevent India from going to war against us, which is actually different. Now, deterrence has 2 or 3 major components. And as far as the doctrine is concerned, the 3 major components are: one is credible minimum deterrence, a no first use policy, and a policy of massive retaliation in answer to a nuclear strike on our forces anywhere. These are the 3 crunch points as far as the nuclear doctrine is concerned. Now, I feel that credible minimum deterrence is the basis on which the other 2 can work. And what is credible minimum deterrence? It has a military factor. You have to have the military capability. It has a political factor, which means you have to have a political hierarchy which has a demonstrated will to show that it can use these weapons if and when required. And third is the psychological factor on other people. We do have a military capability, I can assure you. I'll touch upon each of it a little later. The political will at some stage we thought was lacking. The clear examples being that in 1999 when Kargil took place, whether to expand it or not, because of the nuclear factor or not, is still not clear. But the fact is we kept it very, very limited to the area where the ingress has taken place. You had the parliament attacks, we did nothing. You had the Mumbai attacks, we did nothing. And repeatedly, because of our inaction over the years, Pakistan has started believing that this has been because of the TNW or the nuclear factor. Now, whether that is correct is questionable. In fact, a little later, I must read you out a statement of a paper from the Pakistan SPD regarding the TNWs. So we'll realize what kind of damage we ourselves are doing by conveying to Pakistan that are we sure that we're going to do massive retaliation or not? I'll read out the text from the SPD paper a little later. Now, as far as CMD is concerned, we have the military capability. With the present government in power, the actions that we saw in Myanmar, the actions we saw in Uri and Balakot, these were nothing to do with the nuclear red lines or nuclear factors, nothing at all. When people said we've called a nuclear bluff, I think that is wrong. These three actions by the government of India have only conveyed the willingness of the Indian government to take offensive and aggressive actions if and when required. The statements made by the Prime Minister of India when Arihant was operationalized is another example of showing the strength and the offensive capability of the political mindset. The psychological factor is affected by our own utterances. And for that, I'd like to blame not just the armed forces, but a lot of our defense analysts who say that can we resort to massive retaliation in response to a tactical nuclear weapon strike by Pakistan? Gentlemen, I'll even quote a lot of American people. They say escalation has got nothing to do with the number of weapons or what you're doing. Crossing the the threshold is nuclear escalation, and that is escalation. And this is what India is also saying. There seems to be something wrong with the audio.
Mr. Rahul Rawat, please go on mute. You are disturbing the complete optics here. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the echo is gone. Yeah. So what I was saying was that we have a very mature and a clear-cut doctrine. And we were the only people that within 4 years of a nuclear blast in 1998, in 2003, we had it put it on the internet. Our contention is that nuclear escalation is use of any nuclear weapon, irrespective of yield, irrespective of the number of casualties that will take place, and that is what we say. A lot of questions come up when America went in for a 5 kiloton weapon on their SSBN and they're talking of flexible response. But there are enough examples of very senior people in the American Senate. I could read out a few to you. I've got it lying here. Senator Dianne Feinstein, the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. She's the senior most senator in the United States. She says, let me be clear, there is no such thing as limited use of nuclear weapons. And for a Pentagon advisory board to promote the development is absolutely unacceptable. You have a former defense secretary saying, escalation is escalation, and use of nuclear weapons will be the ultimate escalation. Now, this is what people feel. We also feel that it is not a question of, how much is the other party escalate. We are saying our red line is the nuclear factor. Please do not cross the nuclear line. Now, coming down to what we were talking about leverage of nuclear weapons to cover asymmetry at all levels. Ladies and gentlemen, we should not confuse nuclear wars and conventional wars. These are totally two different levels and they're two different ballgames altogether. We are facing a 2.5 front threat, which is something which has been realistic. And somewhere down the line, even our armed forces had started talking of only limited war with our focus being on CI and CT operations. And we really forgot that that is what was playing into our neighbors' hands. They were happy with us doing CI/CT operations and neglecting conventional warfare. But today, it is something which could happen. I'm not saying it will happen, but a 2-front or a 2.5 is a reality. So we have to focus our attention onto proper conventional operations. Now, leveraging the nuclear factor with China in a nuclear war or in a conventional war, I think is totally unthinkable. China's doctrine is also very clear. It is no first use under any circumstances. is given out 4 or 5 points in their white paper, which is very, very clear. They talk of, if I may just quote Chinese paper, no first use at any time under any circumstances, and etc., etc. And they also, like us, believe in total elimination of nuclear weapons. So I feel for the nuclear factor to come into the Chinese equation should not even be thought of. What would be the circumstances under which China would like to use nuclear weapons against us? Almost all countries are saying, including Russia. Russia is not saber-rattling. They've given out a very clear 4-point doctrine, and they've not been saber-rattling for a long, long time. It's given out very clearly by the Chinese. Now, as far as conventional strength is concerned, why would China use nuclear weapons against us? We will not be in a position, nor are we interested in threatening the vital interests of their existence. And vice versa. I'm sure we should have confidence in our conventional strength. China, yes, has an advantage. We've not modernized for a long time, and we must focus on that. But at the same time, I'd like to categorically state that I'm convinced that we are not a pushover. We would never be put into such a corner that we would have to resort to use of nuclear weapons and expect a retaliation with nuclear weapons for being on a back foot in a conventional war. So I'd like to say that again, that the nuclear factor should not come in as far as conventional war with China is concerned. Now coming to Pakistan, I must quote again, because I had pulled it out, the thought process of the SPD as far as TNWs are concerned and how we reinforced it. Now this I'm reading for an SPD paper, which is a couple of years old. It says tactical nuclear weapons will help thwart Indian designs of securing even limited or sensitive objectives in shallow depth as part of proactive operations. Now, where do we say that we are crossing the red line? The SPD is saying that even if you go in for shallow objectives and they're sensitive, we can use a tactical nuclear weapons. This was fine if we were not a nuclear weapon power. It's very clearly stated by everybody. Nuclear blackmail can be effective only if it is against a non-nuclear weapon power, not against a declared nuclear weapon power. In fact, in 1989, I heard a talk by Mr. K. Subramaniam on the India's nuclear factors, and he clearly brought out at that time, 1989 was roughly 2 years after 1987, where we all felt that Pakistan had a nuclear device given by China in 1987. Mr. Subramaniam clearly brought out that if we are a non-nuclear weapon power and Pakistan has the nuclear weapon, what if they coerce us or they blackmail us? They either you give us Kashmir or we'll nuke you. We were vulnerable at that time. Now, if our thought process has not changed, and we are a strong nuclear weapon power today, and if we are saying that if we use conventional strength in force and Pakistan will use tactical nuclear weapons, I'm sorry, that's a wrong thought. Because Pakistan is equally worried about a massive retaliation from India. Brinkmanship is fine. But our thought process and our discussions is what reinforces their belief. Like I said earlier, a couple of inactions on our part had made them believe that they were right. But today, circumstances have changed, and we must be very confident that we have a mature and a credible nuclear doctrine. I'll just give out a quote again, like I said, from the SPD paper. Now, see, I'd like to quote because we're going wrong in what we are saying. Yeah, it says, Pakistan's TNWs has apparently thrown a spanner in India's strategic planning, as is evident from debates in the Indian think tanks, academic circles, and some sort of backtracking on the cold start doctrine. General BK Sharma's put in as much service as I have done. We are both course-mates. I have had the fortune of commanding the Desert Strike Corps. Nowhere does the Indian government or the defense establishment talk of going slow because of a nuclear backdrop. Our orders have been very clear. There is a laid down political objective for any country going to war. And if we go to war, it would be a political objective translated into military objectives. It has nothing to do with the nuclear factor. The nuclear factor will be controlled by the Strategic Forces Command, the Executive Council, and the Political Council of the Nuclear Command Authority, and we leave it to them. I'd like to stop here and leave it to the other speakers and step in a little later. Thank you, Roshan.
Thank you, General Sharma. I move on to Professor Karnad. Continuing with the nuclear doctrine, I would like to ask you, can India leverage her nuclear weapon to address the asymmetry with China? In other words, can the nuclear deterrence work at the tactical level? If so, then do you feel that we need to review our nuclear doctrine? And what are the specific caveats you think should be reviewed? Over to you, Professor Karnad.
Thank you, Roshan. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
As one of a small group of people who drafted the doctrine, I think the massive retaliation thing that General Sharma talked about was no part of the draft doctrine, incidentally. That was a later, shall we say, development thanks to Brajesh Mishra, singly. And that's very unfortunate because you have to have, when you write a doctrine, have the flexibility of use. When you commit yourself, even in a declaratory sense, to massive retaliation, you then limit your options. And that has been my pet peeve, as it were, ever since 2003, when the Gazetted notions of that particular doctrine was publicized by the government. First of all, there was no business for the government to have made it public and put it on the MEA website. No country in the world has done that. And it has been the most counterproductive thing for us to have done. Because in a sense, we have shown our cards. And that has been to our detriment. The point, I think, is how much do you want to hew to the declaratory aspects of the doctrine as you understand it? General Sharma said, well, massive retaliation is a realizable option. Now, we really have to, and I speak entirely from a realist perspective, have always done so. And I make no distinctions between being an ultra-realist or whatever it is that one is, at least I've been accused of. There's realism and there is non-realism. In that respect, consider how historically countries have used nuclear weapons. Yes, there has been no use by any nuclear weapons power since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But China has actually began using nuclear weapons as a cover for their conventional military inferiority vis-a-vis the United States. And that is very, very clear. That is there when Mao, in his correspondence with Khrushchev, talked about the fact that they expected the Americans to strike anytime with nuclear weapons, as John Foster Dulles, the US Secretary of State, had threatened to do during the Kweimaimatsu crisis, 1958, for instance. That was a direct threat. And said what Mao was saying was, and that's what he told the Politburo and the Kremlin, that if we have nuclear weapons, if you give us the transfer us technology and you help us build it, which they did, we'll be able to allay that threat, blunt that threat. Now, that is one thing. Blunting a threat is one thing. What Mao and the subsequent regimes in Beijing did was they used the nuclear weapons that they acquired from the Soviet Union to, in fact, act as political cover. In case the Americans, after Vietnam, wanted to, shall we say, utilize their conventional military edge against them. And that is the point that the Pakistanis very quickly learned. It is not right, I think, for anybody to claim that Pakistan has not used that nuclear factor And that has not, in some sense, affected the Indian government's thinking and options in real terms. General Sharma mentioned that we did nothing after Parakram and so on and so forth. The parliamentary attack after the attack on Mumbai and so on. There, I think the failing is entirely military in some respects, and many of us know what really happened, and that's not nuclear, and I'll not go into it. But the point, I think, is that massive retaliation is inherently not credible. We can maintain all we want, because the original draft doctrine talked about punitive response, which is the right thing. Well, it's credible. If you initiate even tactical nuclear weapons use, we will respond. And the logic there is tactically, which means in the same yield range, etc. And my simple thing about why the massive retaliation doctrine is not taken seriously by anybody, leave alone the Pakistanis, is this. I remember when we were drafting the doctrine, just a small little jag here. If you recall, there was an attack of the plague in Surat in 1992. That was that's a perfect example of a biological weapons attack. Now, according to our doctrine of massive retaliation, that should have occasioned a nuclear strike. Is it anybody's case that should that occur again, you would nuclear, bomb Karachi? I mean, this is the problem when you maintain certain things that in real circumstances cannot be maintained. Anyway, we are now coming to China and how Pakistan has used nuclear weapons to, in a sense, stop us from exercising cold start or whatever conventional military edge we may have had in the past, etc. We may still have. The point, and that, by the way, is exactly the thing that North Korea used against the US. They said, feel free, and this is very recent, as you recall, when Trump talked about fury and fire and all that nonsense, and they said, fine, we are going to take out Guam, which they did with the Nadong missiles, which they could do. So all that talk about taking out anything is gone, right? What did Trump do? He responded with great offers of, he talked down his threat. And that's when the negotiations began with Pyongyang. So this is the point I think we have to be very clear about, that there are uses of nuclear weapons that we haven't considered. Now, how can we use this vis-a-vis China? If we keep maintaining, talking about massive retaliation, we, in a sense, reduce the credibility of nuclear weapons that have other uses in other circumstances. And the circumstances right now, for instance, stare us in the face in Eastern Ladakh. For instance, had we made it very clear, we can still do that, and that's what I said it in my last book, which predated the Eastern Ladakh thing. And I said it in the very first book that was mentioned, Nuclear Weapons in Indian Security, published in 2002, wherein I said, if we had the atomic demolition munitions, if that would be perfect in terms of their adhering, the ADMs, the atomic demolition munitions, adhering to your passive, reactive, defensive mindset. It would be first used only if the Chinese PLA ingresses through certain valleys and so on to attack us. Now, how would that work in the Eastern Ladakh scenario, for instance? Well, what have we done with our canisterized Agnis? What does canisterization of weapons mean? It means that you can set up a tripwire. You can say that if you do this, we have a tripwire. Of course, you would have to forward position our Agnis and so on, canisterized Agnis. What do the canisterized Agnis do? You have launch on warning, launch on launch capability. What it requires is a political will to use this, convert this to say, here's a tripwire we are placing right up front, which, by the way, was what the NATO doctrine was on the Fulda Gap front. They could not, face the prospect of frontal aviation coming in with massive armor advance So they said, all right, we are going to place our tactical nuclear in a line on the Fulda, and you're going to then let the onus be on the Soviet Union to cross it. It never happened. Now, this is the kind of stuff that we have to take. Now, the problem is that we are so risk averse in everything that we have, in a sense, negatived whatever advantage we have. Forget Pakistan. I do not consider I think our fixation on Pakistan is killing us. And that's been the other theme over the years. And really, if we have to become a little bit more realistic, Pakistan is not a nuclear threat in the sense that the exchange ratio doesn't work for them. You know, we have, I think Dr. General Sharma would know this, in the NSA we have gamed it in, innumerable games wherein the exchange ratios do not work for Pakistan. You know, you have, and I'm not being bloody-minded about it, that's what I'm often accused of being, that, you can take out two cities, Indian cities, I said Bombay and Delhi, but Pakistan as a the entire state of Pakistan as a social organism ceases to exist. And that's a matter of simple physics. And the entire corridor, the strategic corridor that Ayub Khan talked about in 1965 in a post-mortem to his corps commanders, that's precisely the targets. That's all there in our target sets. I mean, why are we talking about Pakistan then? Consider China. Here the point is, what is the exchange ratio for China if it crosses the tripwire? Say it says, well, the Indians do not have the goddamn gumption, they have never showed the nerve for any such thing, are risk averse to a fault. What would the exchange ratio be? Should we turn around and say, this is where we make our stand and you will not cross it except at your risk? And what is the risk? And why are we not prepared to offer the risk and say so plainly, publicly to the Chinese? We are very plain about it, about Pakistan. It's not a threat. It's a ridiculously small little country, a floundering country on our flanks. And here's a huge, big threat that we do not address reasonably. What is the exchange ratio? The exchange ratio is very simple. Our K4s and prospectively the K6s can take out the eastern seaboard, the entire wealth-producing centers of China. That is what you have to hold in hock. That is what the Chinese will be forced. We have to begin to be credible when we pose those kinds of threats. But as Amit General Sharma properly said, we do not have. We just don't do anything. We are risk averse. We don't want to risk anything. And therefore, the whole point about how the Chinese have assumed, if you look at what Global Times, if you look at some of the stuff that are the PLA sources, they're saying plainly the Indians are not going to even do the simple thing of forcing the blockade on the Y junction in the Depsang plains. I mean, that is their attitude. And this is why I think we really have to begin to rethink. And it doesn't really require doctrinal stuff, by the way. Even the old doctrine, the section 4, section 4.2, I think, 2 and 3, survivability, etc., tells you how much elasticity we built into the doctrine. So it's not the doctrinal problem. It is the declaratory stance that you had in 2003, which is the problem. And I think we better begin to appreciate what nuclear weapons can do, their uses, other than as an absolute weapon, which what massive retaliation connotes. I think this is the problem we have, and I think we ought to begin to address it. One last little thing, the thermonuclear weapons of the future, and let me be very clear, this is the other theme. Our thermonuclear weapons are not credible. We really have to begin to resume our testing to have tested and proven thermonuclear weapons. What we have is not a tested and proven thermonuclear high-yield weapon. We do not have it. Even at 200 kilotons, we do not have a credibly tested thing. The point is that with the use of nanotechnologies and so on that the Chinese have done, and I'm not sure we are doing it, we are really allowing the Chinese to get such a march on the power to yield ratio aspects that we'll be at some sense at one remove hugely disadvantaged should the balloon ever go up. Thanks very much.
Thank you.